we're at that inflection point where we're going through an evolution of this. And I'm willing to look at like, maybe this is not the best thing for everyone. And I have to be ready for that moment.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 257, Scaling at Adobe, Kubernetes, Global Networking, and Platform Innovation. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
Victor, we've talked about our friend Carlos Sanchez quite a few times. He's a guy that we've known in our past. We all worked together before, but he's currently at Adobe. And he thinks he knows a lot about Kubernetes, doesn't he?
Let him think that. Let him continue thinking that.
Why are we referencing Carlos today? And Carlos, if you're listening, I'm sorry for poking at you, but it sets us up really good for this show. Today we have on Joseph Sandoval from Adobe. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, you usually talk to vendors and stuff, but not companies using things. Joseph is the person that Carlos goes to get his Kubernetes. Joseph, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you both for letting me be on this show. I guess I could say Happy New Year. It's still January.
Well, as we're recording, yes, but as it comes out, it's April 3rd, so it's fine. You know, we break the fourth wall all the time here, so we're very used to this.
Okay, good.
You run. Actually, why don't you tell us what you run? Because again, I said Carlos comes to you to get his Kubernetes. He goes off the shelf. It's like, here's the Joseph box for Kubernetes. Is it sort of that simple?
Well, it depends, but just to kind of give you some background on what I do at Adobe, I work with a team, the Ethos team, which is our cloud native platform that if you're going to ship anything at Adobe, it's more likely going to go through this platform that runs on Kubernetes. I am in a role now that not only do I run the underlying platform that is in AWS, Azure, as well as we have some on-premise data center, but I also manage kind of like the traffic engineering and API gateway. So yes, Carlos is one of the individuals who comes to me. That's why I try to avoid taking vacations with him, because generally all I get is feature requests for the platform that helps him in his job do less.
Just take him for a beer or gin tonic or something when you're in the same place and he forgets about those requests.
I'll have to use that strategy.
So you just sort of glossed over everything when you said this. AWS plus Azure plus on-premise.
Yes. I can add a little bit of complexity to this as well. We have our own Kubernetes distribution. Not only that, we also are running OpenShift as well.
Are those three interconnected or separate workloads for separate things?
It depends on, generally anybody at Adobe is going to probably use our default distribution, which has really been hardened, it has a security compliance, all the things that we know that is needed to make Kubernetes out of the box usable so that our developers don't have to go through any of that rigor. The OpenShift part is something new that we've added. We're using all the same infrastructure tooling that we have built to be able to support it. It's for a specific solution at Adobe. And so we're helping them. They're using it. It's a strategic platform for them to deliver their service, but it's generally for one specific large segment of Adobe.
When you say, hey, we deliver Kubernetes that is security hardened, right? Safe to use, stuff like that. How much that hinders the work of people using it? If you understand the question. Very often I hear people saying, okay, we are bulletproof security, this or that, and that ultimately results in people not being able to do anything, right? Is it how easy or hard you make it for end users by making it secure?
That's where I think it's still a little bit challenging in the Kubernetes space. I think when I look at last year, we try to maintain, like, for our platform, an N-2 release cycle. Well, sometimes depending on the release, some of these things can be challenging, whether it's API deprecations or even, changes like, the Docker shim deprecation was one of those big things. But even things like pod security policies, and we started to change and evolve there. Like, all these things can be blockers. And if we look at just upstream, and this is just outside and like looking at the CNCF, I was surprised to see the data on how many people are running on legacy versions of Kubernetes that are running without support. So ideally, we have to do a lot of work to, in advance, help teams identify when we're going to roll something out. Hey, this may break. You need to address some of these APIs that you're using that are going to be deprecated. Or we have C groups V2 being rolled out, and you're running a certain version of Java. You're going to have problems if you do not upgrade that. So we try to do a lot of that lifting, that they may do some of that discovery. Now, I'll be honest, it's never 100% always perfect, but we do have a team that is dedicated to rolling out these versions and trying to make some of that friction a little bit easier so that they can kind of avoid the surprises that could happen when you get to production with a new version of Kubernetes.
And since you're running your own distribution, how long does it take? So tomorrow, new version of Kubernetes lands, right? What's the work involved there for you, right?
Yeah, to be honest, that's actually the easy part. I would say if I had it, because we have it so dialed in, we probably could, if it was a day, that's probably a hard day. Like, we found something that's broken through our tests and we identified. I would be surprised if we are generally probably in 8 hours, 4 to 8 hours is when we will have something tested, ready to go. But it's always the more interaction with, when we start to like look at our tenant workloads, that's where things start to get slowed down.
By tenants workloads, I guess you're kind of gradually expanding that new version, right? And then watching what's happening, deciding whether to continue or not, something in that direction, or?
Yes. So a lot of times what we'll do is we're going to run these in stage environments. Our tenants usually look to these environments to kind of be that early signal. We recently have really evolved our infrastructure build tooling. We've, like a lot of people, have evolved to using things like Cluster API, along with, the Argo tooling. And what we really want to do is even decouple more of our monolithic, because that's where we started from, is that monolithic release cycle of rolling out to our fleet. And it would be the same rinse and repeat, where we would get a new version. It would roll out to the fleet. A bunch of things would break. We'd go fix these things. We'd have, outages. Now we're trying to be a little bit more flexible and agile when we allow teams to, ideally, I would love to be able to, similar to like how EKS and AKS manage their releases, but allow teams to really adopt them when they're ready. Like, let's push down a lot of these things, so that the signals that we have, so that they know when it's safe for them to go forward and avoid outages, and really try to see if we can improve our current upgrade cycle.
What happens when you have a team that was happy with what they installed into, and 5 years later, they still don't want to upgrade?
That's something that we really try to avoid. And you're right, Darren, that is something that is challenging. No one wants to deal with like a lot of that upgrades. That's why we're looking at the reformation of like working group LTS upstream to kind of address that and reduce down the amount of upgrades. I'm still ambivalent on that. I'm not sure if that's the right move or not. I actually feel like 3 releases a year is a really good cadence, but I'm fortunate because I'm part of a platform team. I have a big org behind me. If I was not in this same situation, and maybe like in my previous role, I probably would be more inclined to look at a longer term, like give me a year support. That, I think, is still an area that may be a solution for teams that are struggling with staying current. But as far as with your original question, we really try to push teams. We've had some situations where I think I had one team that was on an unsupported version of Kubernetes for a very specific reason. And we worked hard to address, to get them, like whatever the libraries that was like conflicting, we worked really hard to make sure that we could help them move forward.
When you said N-2, I'm assuming you're meaning minor version, meaning 28's current as of today, which means you're only running 26. Is that
correct?
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I didn't think your N-2 was on the patch version. That would have been crazy.
No.
That would be
that would
insane.
be crazy. I'd love to see if we could get there, but yeah.
Honestly, I'm impressed because I'm still cannot understand how companies manage to follow up the Kubernetes release cycle, right? It's just, I'm a person who likes frequent updates. I think that that's a good thing. But for a company to 3 or 4 times a year upgrade or wait and then have to go through each individual minor release until they get wherever they want to go can be challenging.
Yeah, that is for sure. And believe me, I know when I talk to a lot of my more larger tenants with these deployments, it's never easy. We're always trying to find ways to reduce down that friction. Every once in a while, we are able to kind of I think we went through 127 pretty quietly. It was great. But you also look at that release and there wasn't anything really major that would cause, a user to have to do a lot of preemptive work to make them ready for that release.
So you're still at 26 in production. So when would 27 become available for people for production use?
We are just starting to, if I look back, this is in February is when we started to roll that to our fleet.
It's fast.
So if people are still on 26, okay, let me ask this question then. So you try to keep it N-2. That's your happy state, right?
Yes.
Preferably everybody be on 26. But I have a feeling that not everybody is on 26. In fact, you already alluded to that. Somebody was running a really long time ago. So in your state today, how many different versions are actually running in production?
At this moment, just 2, 125 and 126.
Okay. And that's what you try to keep it at, right?
We try to keep it there. And that was very specific. It takes a real exception. This one, I would say I blame it on the generative AI being the reason why this one is on 125. But outside of that, we've been really, our rigor has been strong in keeping our tenants current. We will triage and allocate resource to help some of these teams if it's something that's within our control to be able to help them do the upgrades.
Okay, you just cracked open the generative AI can. Why did 25 matter to them? What were they doing that it made it so I have to stay here?
There was probably more. It's outside of Kubernetes. I think some of this is just the rapid pace of development of what's happening with some of the varying software that we're using to support our LLMs. This one was related to driver issues related to, we use Flatcar. And that was some of the challenges that we had is just the team was looking on more experimental libraries to push forward. So I think part of it is just the teams are pushing very aggressively forward, and we are trying to maintain a distribution that we feel like Flatcar is ideally kind of like the way we like to run our fleet. But at times we do run into incompatibilities with some of the software that we're using upstream, whether it's like NVIDIA driver related or maybe other operators that we're using in their environments to support them with building out these deployments.
So you've mentioned a few times you're using your own distribution. And Victor was asking, okay, how long does it take? You were saying 4 to 8 hours. You can probably have, at least happy path in place.
Yeah.
Why do you need your own distribution?
We're actually moving away from this now that we're still in the midst of migrating most of our fleet over to EKS and AKS. We still have this data center deployment. That one we'll still maintain that version of it. But I think that's, to be honest, is the easiest part of things. That has not been a really complex. And, one thing about Adobe is we've been a product of acquisitions, and it's kind of interesting to see some of the teams that we bring on board who are also doing Kubernetes. We had one acquisition where I kind of saw they were doing the same thing, pulling down from upstream, building their distribution. That was pretty trivial. It was always everything after that seemed to be the challenge.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get square in my head. Why even bother doing your own distribution? Why not just pick one of the distributions? Even with the on-prem, What was our friend? KubeADM, right? Just KubeADM, all the things.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And I think and I'll give you a good example. So we have OpenShift that I was mentioning. There's a lot of learnings that we've had within our fleet that we kind of built tooling to kind of work around. We had a feature that may eventually appear upstream, but it's a feature that OpenShift is actually implementing in regards to how we even upgrade stateful type workloads. And this feature, Park Nodes, is something that OpenShift didn't have. So we had to work around some of these things. Well, there's a lot of optimizations that we have figured out that we've rolled down into our distribution, very specific, probably to Adobe itself. At times, there's some things that we will like try to see if we can influence upstream, bring them back up with some of these learnings. But that's the stuff that we'd have to close the gap on if we said, okay, let's just always use OpenShift for the whole fleet. Now, could we get there? Sure. But I think it's so trivial right now because all the tooling has been built. This has been over since like 2016, since we've done a lot of this, that this is all pretty mature tooling. And we've actually now leveraged more modern ways of deploying, like Cluster API, for example, is the way that we like to do and running our fleet, using these things along with Argo CD and rollouts. Like we just kind of figured like there's not a lot of gain for us at this point to go back and say, all right, because we have kicked the tires on a few things over time. We have looked at VMware's offering when they had a distribution. We did analysis of Google. And I'll be honest, if they would have been available to us in 2018, we would have been all over it. We would have been like, this makes sense. But by the time they got to market, it was already too late for us.
When did you jump on Kubernetes then? You said before they had distribution, stuff like that. So Adobe is like relatively early adopter then, right?
Adobe, well, they actually were doing Mesosphere before they did Kubernetes.
Oh, okay.
I was probably the outlier. I was the outlier at that time through an acquisition in 2016 where we were doing Kubernetes. They were kind of saying, hey, and originally that was what the platform was really built on. I think that was some of the challenges that we did face, though, is you don't think about these things until later on. And so our Git repository is very reflective of some of the thinking to make Mesosphere behave like Kubernetes or give that Kubernetes-like experience until eventually it was like, we probably should just switch this under the hood and move to Kubernetes because of the state of where Mesosphere was at that time.
So you said you own Ethos, which is your distribution name, which it sounds like you're trying to move away from as quickly and as safely as possible. Yes, no, maybe somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's happening, organically as we move to cloud providers distribution. Yeah.
So probably over the next 5 to 7 years, Ethos will no longer exist unless something goes completely haywire.
The brand name is there. We kind of keep that as kind of a branding in a sense internally. But as far as like what's really like that distribution part that I was mentioning, that part is actually going away. As I was mentioning, one of the things that really disrupted us was really GitOps in our infrastructure. And that's where, as I was mentioning just a little bit earlier, our underlying structure of how we build this whole distribution kind of blew up when we tried to overlay like Argo rollouts. And we were like, hey, we could do this really cool thing. Let's like just take this, bolt it on. We can kind of like get away from a monolithic release, and then now use Argo rollouts to be able to do these things to make individualize each server or each cluster so that they can all be at their own speed and pace. Well, that initial version of what we were building imploded. I remember this is like I went to Valencia KubeCon, had some conversations around it, started to see my scaling issues and realized like, hey, our Git layout and how we design this is not going to work in this new world. And that's when we went back and rethought, we need to rethink our tooling. And that coincided with the timing of the maturity of EKS and AKS as well. So these things all kind of were just natural iterative things that we evolved into. There was some things we were able to bring along tooling wise, some of the philosophies of how we design and build things, but there was a lot of under the hood stuff that was being changed. So the Ethos car, how it looked was all great and shiny. Underneath, we were changing the engine out of how we're building and distributing this thing.
So you also own the API gateways. Those are fairly boring, I would assume, just API gateways.
They're fairly boring, but they're very important.
Well, that's where the next part I'm asking is you also own traffic engineering.
Yes.
Which I'm assuming means Envoy is probably in the mix, at least some of the times.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot avoid that. Envoy is unavoidable. It's like etcd. You cannot
Envoy is on.
Is there anything else that's sort of in that traffic shaping, I'm going to call it right now, play for you?
Before you answer that, I want to go back a moment. You said Gateway API is very important. Why is that so?
Gateway API or API Gateway, I said.
API Gateway. Names are ridiculous in our industry. Okay, my bad.
We don't do good in that. Like, yeah, Gateway API, that was a bad name. but it is very important. It is important. It is kind of that spec is the future of where we should all be moving towards. And I think the one thing that group is doing a really good job of is providing ways to get there, because it's one thing if you make a spec, but if you don't help people get to that spec, and that's where we have always had trouble in the Kubernetes community, is when it comes to networking. But Darren, to go back to your question, yeah, we're also early Cilium users. We're actually probably one of the largest early adopters of Cilium, and we probably were one of the largest users of it. I think a few other companies superseded us over the last few years, and then we kind of emerged back as being one of the top end users of Cilium.
Is Cilium now your full networking solution, or you put a service mesh on top of it? Because kind of there are certain overlaps these days. And
yeah, no, that's and now you're hitting a dicey spot of where we are at with it. So Cilium and Envoy are both they're like core to our underlying platform. If I look at like where we're going in the future, like these things are things that Kubernetes could even at some point decline internally, and we may move to other things. But those are the two things I think intrinsically are going to keep moving forward as we start to look more towards the edge. So I think from a overall strategy of like service mesh and where these things are at, we've always been very kind of incremental in our view of it. We want to make sure that we are building something that it's solving our tenants, our customers' needs. And for a long time, service mesh, we had some incremental aspects of it. We have TLS in the environments, but it wasn't only until recently that we really decided that service mesh was strategic. And I think that strategy of how we looked at it is reflective of, you look at this industry space today. What you're seeing now is, and what I'm evaluating is like API gateways with service mesh. All these things are converging. If you look at like Solo, Kong, all these companies, they were kind of like decoupled and all like separate, like, hey, I got this, API gateway. Oh, I have this other thing. Now what are you saying? Consolidation. I'm really curious to see how this space falls out. Now, I'm not saying these areas are not important. I think one trend I am seeing is requests for how secure our environments, how are you communicating with services? And I still have this long-term North Star of like, I'd love to see zero trust be the things, because I think that's where we need to be at. How do we get there and is a whole nother thing. But these incremental things are very important. So we've been really strategic about a mesh, and we do have some tenants that we work with that use Istio, but is Istio part of our overall offering? It's not. And Cilium is very interesting, their road and how they went. They've started from L4 and now they've moved up. And you're seeing like it's become its own ecosystem, because now you see like ambient mesh is starting to emerge. So I feel like we made a real smart strategic source and making that our investment. Now let's see what happens with the acquisition, because I've always believed in that Cilium team. I think they're a great, smart engineering group, and I hope that they can stay on that same trajectory.
That's essentially why I asked the question, right? Because in the past, we all used a couple of solutions, stacking them on top of each other. Like you use something for networking like Cilium, and then use service mesh, and then use this and that. And they seem to be all expanding into becoming, you need only this type of solution, right?
Yeah, I agree. So I think that's where, I have, some concerns as I watch this space. And there's a lot of stuff in the CNCF where like the landscape is just, some things live, some things die. I think we're about ready to kind of go through some evolution in that service mesh space. And so we've really tried to dial in of like, all right, when our customers ask for certain things, like I said, I'm getting MTLS requirements coming in, we'll meet those. And we're really probably in this year is the first time where I felt like, okay, now it's time for us to introduce some of these things into our environments. But if you look at what service mesh was at in 2019 versus where we're at today, there's a lot of things that kind of like superseded what the value it brings. Now we have a lot of our developers using Argo. So we do have some teams using the functionality of being able to do blue-green testing or do all these things, but it's always better when you could get closer to what you're working on. So that's where Argo kind of took that away. Observability is evolving. I finally feel like we're kind of getting there with it, with like what's happening with Hotel. Let's see. But then what happens? Like it starts to give you the insight. So I think what's happening is like these other areas are maturing and taking away what you really need to provide in a mesh.
I have the theory that open source projects, especially in foundations, they go through cycles. And then at one moment we have consolidation and a winner, right? That takes it all. And then we move to something else, right? And CNCF, I believe, is now in that earlier phase. Still, you have 57 projects for every single thing you can imagine you want to do. But now we can see things like with Otol and Cilium. Cilium basically became the de facto standard. There is almost no networking outside worth talking about, right? I feel that we are entering into not expansion, but contraction of CNCF, at least from the perspective of usage, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if you remember this last KubeCon, I think Tim Hawkins on the keynote, he mentioned something that I almost got triggered just a little bit, but he mentioned like OpenStack's big tent. And to me, I'm like, when he referenced that we're at our big tent moment, I think maybe we are. Maybe we're starting to see of like some of these projects, like what are they bringing? Maybe we should just consolidate down because there is a lot out there. And in some of these spaces, it is kind of important to focus on what is the most meaningful thing? Like we just can't keep having 10 projects in a space. It's nice to kind of have a few clear, strong winners.
At least until somebody comes up with something radically different, right? And so I'm absolutely not against innovation and stuff like that. But right now, there's just too much. And too much is good in terms of innovation, but not good for the end user, right? I get questions from people all the time. Okay, so which one should I pick from those 575 projects? What can I tell you, man? I don't know.
That's why we keep coming back to your guys' podcast. We gotta have someone like looking at these things for us.
I want to go back to something that you said. You say these couple of one-liners, and all of a sudden, bam! It's like, did he really just say that? You were talking about the potential. And Victor and I have talked about this, the potential of Kubernetes declining in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went on to say something about moving to the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we get to the moving to the edge part, we'll come back and revisit that whole thing. If I was Carlos and I wanted to deploy a new application and I wanted it to be worldwide, can I do that on Ethos?
The container, like that environment, your locality, is going to be limited by the amount of like regions and zones that we're supporting globally. And I think his group is actually very interesting that he's working on because they're actually really one that is really pushing what we can do and really, as a product manager, my role, like I have to live in the future. I can't just keep living in like Kubernetes is always going to be here. Like this is going to be, yes, is it something that I love working in and loving the community? It is great. But I'm always having to look forward and I'm having to balance out like our strategies of where I see these things heading. And for example, for like I was mentioning his group, like they're actually one of the first that have moved into more of like a serverless from the ground up rewrite mixed with using Fastly along with, with Cloudflare and building something that is getting even more reach than what we could provide with our containerized platform. It's also changing the developer experience because that's a lot of the things that I'm seeing request-wise is I get teams coming to me like, Joe, we want to use your platform, but we need to do collaborative editing on the edge. We can do this to an extent, and we've looked at varying different ways to do this. We've looked at Amazon's like local zones to provide further reach. But I think the best experience so far that I'm starting to see is when we see teams using things like Cloud for Workers, which are like more, starts moving us into that thing that we keep thinking is going to happen, which is like WASM, which, I love to say for us, like I'm seeing some adoption, but it's still too early and the language support is not there. So it's still something that holds us back, but it is something where I'm starting to notice happening. And I'm always looking at, we're always about the developer experience. If I had to really say, what is the thing that Ethos is doing? It's the developer experience. We have a paved path approach. We could also provide you just clusters. But the key thing is we want to make it easy for you to ship things. Ideally, you're not going and firing up your own EKS and doing your own CI/CD. We'd love to be able to take that away from you and allow you just to focus on your product and how you get there, the feature-wise.
So what you're telling me, in no specific words, is people are not mandated to use Ethos.
There used to be a mandate, but I've pushed against that. I don't like mandates. I like to win people or win our customers, our tenants. I wanted to use our platform because it's the best to use and saves them cycles. on all these other things that they could be building. Like, why not just focus on your product?
Going back to your claim that you need to be prepared for the time when, and that's my interpretation, when Kubernetes is not around anymore, right? What did you mean by that? Because I like to separate people. When they say Kubernetes, they mean many different things, right? They can mean containers are not going to be there. We're going to use Wasm, right? Or they can mean Kubernetes API is not going to be there, right? And I tend to have a very different timelines for those two. I have a theory that Kubernetes API is going to live much longer than the current implementation of that we are using. Containers, for example, right?
No, you're probably right. I'm probably right there with you in that sense, meaning just take, for example, like my last year with like generative AI. And the one thing that I think I got out of it was, out of all the things that we looked at, and we went through a lot of different things behind the scenes, and some of this is Kubernetes related. Some of this stuff is like CRDs or operators that we're running on top of the platform to support this. Some are open source, some are not open source. But the one good thing about it was Kubernetes was good enough. And really what we mean is a Kubernetes API. Now, you're right, Victor. I think to qualify, I do think that that's going to live long, but I'm always trying to be, am I seeing this through my experience? Because I've been with this community for over 10 years and I just want it to keep living. I want to think it's like Linux, but I also have to live in a world where that may not be the case. And we've seen that happen with, sometimes it's not the best scheduler for things. And so maybe the scheduler doesn't live on, or maybe it does, or we see a revision of it. That's kind of what I'm looking at. So then it starts to raise the question, maybe it is just a Kubernetes API. And that is the thing that seems to be extensible. And we're at that inflection point where we're going through an evolution of this. And I'm willing to look at, like, maybe this is not the best thing for everyone. And I have to be ready for that moment. So that's kind of where I try to live in that world. Believe me, I'm with you. I don't see that happening in the next 5 years. We'll see. There's a lot of change happening, and that could happen in 3 years. So let's see what happens.
I can see those drastic changes in 5 years. I can easily see how Wasm can actually become a dominant thing, right? I would have nightmare if I would have to think that we might not have the API itself. Scheduler, forget about it, replace it, change it, remove it, containers, I can live without them, right? But the whole mental model and the troubles that we solved by finally having an API that somehow works, right, is a huge difference, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. That probably is the one thing that is still makes it really what Kubernetes is really valuable at, and is allowing us to adapt. And the other parts are kind of interchangeable. I really was, a few years ago, really excited to see, I know you're close to Crossplane, watching things like KCP. Like, I've always kind of wondering, like, well, maybe it's just the Kubernetes API with a few control planes and we get something bespoke, but that's really the advanced thing. But I really have been really pragmatic with this one. Workload types, you're right. Like that probably could change. I'd love to see it change, to be honest. It would mean so much for us if we get the language support in Wasm. It'd be amazing, because then it really is going to fundamentally change what we can do for our customers.
So under Ethos, again, I'm trying to pull at the strings of Ethos right now.
Sure.
In Ethos, are you rolling in the Cloudflare and Fastly support under that platform? In other words, they can just come in and, I want this.
Today, we have not completely put it under the developer experience, but it's very easy to integrate these things in your environments. These are things we're using currently already, for CDN, WAF. Those are things that we just have to have to be able to deliver to our clients and save costs. Down the line, when we start talking more specifically about like a cloud for workers, for example, that potentially could be something that we will do, and we're having these conversations around it. But really, it's really trying to not build solutions, then we have to go find customers. We're really trying to take feedback in to make sure that, are these the right things? And so right now we continually go back, get these requests, try to see if some of the things are the right abstraction or the right underlying kind of like runtimes for these environments. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next year or two if, yes, those things become part of our core platform.
As part of your core platform, what is the one thing you wish you could get rid of today?
Wow. The one thing I wish I could get rid of, I think if anything, it was probably not so much what I could get rid of because we're in motion to kind of get rid of some of our legacy approaches to how we're building and managing clusters. I mean, that's definitely one for sure. We've really have taken one core philosophy that predated me, and that's when it came to more like stateful type workloads where we really don't fully support, like people build stateful stuff all the time on our platforms, but we haven't really fully committed to those. So I think if anything, that would be the one thing I wish we had a little bit more support for, because that's where I see some of the cost optimizations, kind of the resiliency challenges can kind of come in. And so if anything, it's more a matter of what I wish we did more of.
How large is the team that you work with at Adobe?
So, and bear in mind, this is, multiple team that I work for the developer platforms team, and there's probably almost close to 200 in that team. As far as like the specific team that's working on the infrastructure and the reliability of that platform, that's probably about 60.
And I would assume those people are worldwide.
They are. Yes. We have teams that are based out of India, Romania, and the US.
And I imagine every one of those people will carry a pager.
I would say most do on call. Managers, everybody included. Yes. I think unless you're at I'm not at that level yet where I can just ignore everything and not be involved. But yes, we do have a few of those.
The point I'm trying to get to is a company the size of Adobe. You've got about 60 people worldwide that keep all of the outside applications up and running for the 7 billion people that use Adobe products.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good ratio. How do you scale for something? How do you even think at that kind of scale?
I mean, we just came off of the largest streaming event in the United States earlier this year. And that actually surprisingly didn't have any outages or any effect. And when I say largest streaming event, I know we know all the familiar platforms like Netflix and all these others like that, but this was more a live sports event. And our usual on-call person was there. We have, the traditional, someone who's primary, secondary, but it's been the maturity of the platform has helped us. And don't get me wrong, we do get outages, and sometimes they could be really painful. And then we kind of have to really decide, like maybe it's let's deploy more clusters. Got to spend a little money to kind of get out of some of this pain. I know some of the team members where we've gone through a lot of growth over the years. It was painful probably the first couple of years I was here and first joined the team. I almost regretted joining the team because of how much noise there was. And you know how it is sometimes when you get so much noise, you just kind of are like, you get numb to that pain. But we've actually have decided to really commit to improving the quality of our tooling, more auto remediation, really trying to like make it so that it's less painful. And it's still a work in progress. Like there are some times it gets really challenging. We do have those times where it's very frustrating because then, you hit that holiday freeze. You'd love to make changes and you have to go through a lot of like approval process. But I think our evolution, especially with like our build infrastructure tooling, things like Cluster API, things like Argo has really changed what we're able to do. And we're able to really isolate and respond quickly when we do have an outage.
Speaking of outage, sometimes people might think there's an outage, but in reality, there isn't. I'm talking about IP addresses. Some people, I don't know why people actually think this. There's more than one type of IP address. Did you know that, Joseph?
Yeah, I've heard about this.
So there's IPv4. I have to say this very slowly because it's hard to say. And then there's IPv6. Now, in theory, we're going to run out of IPv4 addresses 15 years ago, 20 years ago, somewhere in that area.
We've been on that precipice.
But now we're starting to see IPv6 raising its head in lots of weird places. How about you? Are you seeing that as well?
This is one where I have quietly noticed this, and I've also kind of noticed we've been working around this problem for quite a while. And I've noticed requests come in and I'm wondering like, well, hey, why do you want to build this architecture? And it's like, well, we've exhausted what we can do inside an AWS VPC with the IP addressing. And so we decided to build this cell architecture. And I'm like, if we'd adjusted IPv6, we probably could do this and without all this complexity. The other thing I've gotten into conversations around is just from external, like requests coming in. And this actually had us look at like, is it time for us at Adobe to work with a lot of our networking teams? And we obviously in my organization have our own dedicated trafficking team, but I'm talking more of the team that's really managing the global network. And they've been really trying to work with us as we make unreasonable requests for large blocks of IPs, which are getting more difficult to provision. And they're like, look, we're not going to be able to make this come to us at FY25 and you're not going to get this fulfilled. And now I'm noticing as we did this kind of like, let's look at what's a landscape look like. We're noticing adoption, and it's actually caused us to be like, it's time for us to strategize and make this happen. Now there's a lot to it. And I think we're really just looking at more of like our, kind of core on the edge side of things where it reaches our zones. The whole internal, that's a whole nother thing. But I think it is definitely happening slowly. It's going to be this quiet wave, and it's kind of my opinion.
I hope it stays quiet.
I do too.
And rolls in slowly, because that's going to be a pain. It's going to happen at some point.
I was saying all my IPv4 knowledge of like, how do I calculate subnets is out the window.
Absolutely. So if people are wanting to get into platform engineering, right? That's all the hotness has been for the past 12-ish months. You're working at scale in one of the world's largest companies in platform engineering. What does it take to be able to work in a team like that?
I think the core things of like DevOps still carry over. I think that's really the thing that I still see, even though we call it platform engineering, there is some very different thinking, I think, going into it. I really try to talk to my teams more from I'm always bringing a lot of here's what we're doing for the broader Adobe with solutions, and this help them really connect. Because I think the one challenge of being in a platform is being so abstracted that you lose sight of like why we're building this platform and are we building for the right things, and not just making assumptions of like features that we want to roll out because we want to roll them out. Like we have to be very disciplined. So I think a lot of the same things are that still hold true, except I think I'll add another wrinkle to it. I think you really should start using tools like Copilot to help you if you're still on a coding journey. Use these tools. Don't just use them to do your job, but help them explain things to you. I would say, I'm still learning as I go along, and I use these tools all the time, especially because I live in a world where there's so much distraction, and it helps me to kind of get on point when I'm having to walk through like a code base. I can easily grab it and it just gets me there. As far as like really the core skills, automation doesn't go away. I'm actually looking for more higher levels of automation on the team. I think the other part is just the ability to reuse different parts of our platform. And so a lot of times I get teams really coming to me with different ideas of what we should build for our platform. But I'm always saying if we can reuse different components, because we do build a lot of little microservices in our control plane that kind of help deliver the whole experience of Ethos. I want individuals that are curious and understand these things. Can they build a lot of these things and be able to kind of from the ground up when I bring them, hey, I need this type of like service. And I want them to be able to kind of like build from the building blocks that we either have or build from upstream building blocks. But I think you have to always be building. That's the thing I always really try to encourage is just know how to use a lot of these tooling. Pick a good programming language if you can to help you along the way, whether it's like our group is kind of interesting because we're kind of split. We started with Python, then we went to Go, and now guess what? Python is still there. So we're kind of we have both.
Oh, this is a lesson for people listening. Are you saying that you need to write code to be DevOps something today called platform something?
I don't think you have to write code. It definitely helps. I would say you're going to be a lot more confident in your journey. But like myself, like I'm just using, GPT-based editors to help me get there now. So I can really navigate what I need to navigate and make changes when I need to make changes. So I think that is definitely helpful to get there. There's always going to be specialties areas where that are in the platform that are a little bit different. But even when you look at like the traffic engineering group, they're building like Rust-based kind of like frameworks, things underneath that help. So you kind of need to have that if you're going to advance into the platform. You can always come in and bring value with YAML and JSON and all these things. But I think you're going to go a lot further if you can kind of like deepen your knowledge and pick up a programming language along the way.
So you said Python to Go, Python's still around.
Hmm.
I'm guessing maybe bash scripts are the third most important language there.
Oh, I think, yeah, that's the glue. You got to have that.
All of Joseph's contact information is going to be down in the episode description. Joseph, anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think, like I said, appreciate you guys having me on. If anybody wants to connect with me at any of the events, like I'm always very active at KubeCon, a lot of the contributor summits. Feel free to reach out to me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.